In this lecture, we are going to look at part 2 of our definition of personal data, which is relating to. And when it comes to relating to, there are 3 key aspects that you need to consider. These are linkability, objects, processes, and events, and the WP29's concept of relatability. And with regards to relatability, you need to consider content, purpose, and result. When it comes to linkability, it's important to understand that the relationship between the person and identifier is not always obvious. If you think about a large organization, for example, you're likely going to have a handful of people who all share the same birthday. So a birthday on its own, if you have an organization that has over 100,000 people, may not be particularly useful. But if you have a single birthday within a small office, depending on what the age range of the people in the office is, then you may be able to link a person and their date of birth, just depending on how old or young a person looks. And so context is important. There are other types of identifiers which clearly have a direct relationship to someone. For example, a name, a social security number, or some other type of unique identifier like an employee ID. Another consideration when it comes to related to is objects, processes, and events. And so, for example, if you know that a person owns a house, then depending on what state, and I'm thinking at least in the United States, I imagine there may be comparable public records laws in the European Union. But in the United States, if you have someone's address, depending on the state that you live in, you can access a ton of other data about that person that would tell you how much the house is worth, what that person's tax liability is. And again, that might give you some indication into what the person's net worth or annual salary might be. And so an object like a house or a car or the type of jewelry that they wear, those types of objects can sometimes tell us a lot about a person. Similarly, if you have an object, you may also have a process. For example, calculating a home's energy consumption. Again, depending on where you live, utility bills may be a matter of public record. And again, depending on where the person lives, how much sunshine the house gets at certain times of the day or certain times of the year, you may be able to demonstrate that this is an energy efficient house. And so a house can tell you a lot about a person. It can also tell you a lot about different processes. And finally, events such as this person ate at this restaurant. If you know this person ate here and what they ate, then that gives you some idea as to what the person likes or dislikes, or perhaps what type of allergies they have. For example, this person ordered something that was both vegan and gluten-free. Similarly, depending on how the food is delivered, that could tell you about the quality of service at the restaurant, the quality of the chef, or even the quality of the food that they purchased to cook the dishes in the kitchen. So again, with regards to relating to objects, processes, events, these are all important considerations. Now, regarding relatability, we're taking this from the WP29, again, opinion 4/2007, which we saw a little earlier. And here the WP29 says that for personal data to relate to an individual, one of 3 elements must apply. And these elements are content, purpose, and result. And we're going to look at each of these in turn. Concerning content, this applies when the data is inherently about a particular person. And so the data describes or identifies an individual. Examples of information that might directly identify an individual would be a medical report, an employee file, or perhaps a passport with an RFID chip. And here RFID is an acronym for radio frequency identification. And so with these types of chips, you can scan something and it's the radio frequency that transfers the data. And so I can scan my smart card, and if someone is behind a screen, then that might automatically pull up my information. Another consideration is purpose. And this applies when data is used or intended to be used to evaluate, treat, or affect a particular person. What is the purpose of the information? What is its intention? This applies even if the data is not inherently about a person. And again, the objective is to make a decision about or influence an individual. And examples would include telephone logs, vehicle GPS data, and access card logs. And so with an access card, for example, We can track an employee's attendance. When did they badge in? When did they badge out? That would tell us how long they were in the building for, whether or not they were late, whether or not they left early, etc. Finally, for this lecture is result. This applies when the processing of data affects a person's rights, interest, or status. Examples include fleet tracking, surveillance footage, and statistical data. When it comes to fleet tracking, this could be monitoring a delivery route, for example, where's the car at what time, but can also tell us about the driver's behavior. Similarly, for surveillance footage, perhaps a CCTV camera is positioned outside a grocery store for general safety, but you could also use that to discipline an employee who is habitually tardy, for example. And a final example with regards to statistical data, perhaps the data is anonymized, but later it could be re-identified and used to impact an identifiable individual. In this lecture, we looked at the second part of personal data, which is relating to. With regards to linkability, it's important to understand that a relationship between a person and an identifier is not always obvious. Context is important. There are, however, some identifiers that are going to directly link a person, such as their name, social security number, or other unique identifier. We also looked at objects, processes, and events. There's a lot we can tell about a person's house, for example, such as their tax liability, their home's energy efficiency, and other events such as eating at a restaurant can also tell us about someone's dietary needs. Concerning relatability, WP29 says that for personal data to relate to an individual, one of three elements must apply. Those are content, purpose, and result. When it comes to content, this applies when data is inherently about a particular person. The data describes or identifies that individual. With regards to purpose, this applies when data is used or intended to be used to evaluate, treat, or affect a particular person. It applies even if data is not inherently about the person. And the objective of this type of data is to make a decision about or to influence someone. And finally, a result. This applies when the processing of data affects a person's rights, interests, or status.